So without any further ado, I would like to welcome Prof. Audrey Moores as the first speaker for today, talking about the regulations to enable green chemistry. To Professor Audrey Moores from McGill University, please, I allow you to the stage. Please give a warm applause. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Is it working? Yes. So the no, that's not it. Okay. Oh yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. He was good. Great. Thank you so much. Welcome everybody. How you doing today? Ready to start day 3? Yeah. Cool. So today we're going to talk about regulations as a driver for change and international conventions. And we're going to talk about success stories. So we do know that it takes time, but these have been tremendous efforts that we're going to talk about today. These have been efforts that have had led to really tremendous change. And we're going to talk about those success stories to really try to help as well shape the future and shape also the way that you can have conversations with your own governments and see how you can help as well in that sense. So what's really interesting in general looking into this, and we see this in this room, is that we're coming from an incredibly diverse background. I've heard some of you are scientists, some of you are legal experts, some of you are working in a lot of are engineers, some are scientists, some are more looking into this from a physical standpoint, a chemical standpoint, a biological standpoint, uh, some are more economists. So we all look at this problem with different lenses, right? And what's important is that uh, we need to, in fact, embrace all of our different vision of this problem and be more inclusive in the way we look into this. One way to look into this, that's the chemist view, where you're going to have a vision where the chemistry matters most, the bonding, the interactions, and then the commercialization, and then the planetary boundaries are over there, and we don't really look into them. We could also look at it from the other perspective, that may be the perspective more of the environmental scientists, to say, no, ecosystem come first, everything, and then you don't really consider the chemistry, and you can't go really far either, right? So what you need is a more balanced approach when actually you are able to to view them with all of them with the importance that they have. Is that okay? And recognize that all of the different ways with which we look at into this is important. So why do we need chemical regulations? That's because when we look at the different aspects of the consequences of chemicals to our lives, whether this is the human health, we discussed this, the definition of green chemistry is to make chemistry better for human health and environmental health. So these are some of the centerpiece of why we need to implement better green chemistry. And I will make the argument that regulations is one mechanism. But there's also a case to be made about this around innovation and free movement. That is because if you live in a world where there is no regulation, no framework for people to think about these problems, you may have tomorrow a company that starts and make really dirty chemistry and steal customers from you. And for you doing green chemistry, good stuff, this is a huge risk for you to live in this environment, because why are you going to continue to work if there's a risk that a competitor comes in doing bad chemistry and steals your market, your customers, and eventually your jobs, right? So for all of these reasons, it's really important to have chemical regulation in place. So that what we can do is we can really orient the market towards good science as opposed to toxic ones. And we want to protect human health and the environment, but on the other hand, also enable innovation and trade. And I think it's really important to understand here that regulation is often seen in tension with innovation, saying, oh, regulation is going to hold us back, and so on and so forth. And it may, and it can, if it's not written the right way. But it's also a mechanism by which you can make a fair landscape for greener innovation to thrive. right? Is this something really controversial? Do you agree with me on that point? Yeah? You want to say something, Matt? Yeah.
So, I think a lot of people think regulation is really boring. A lot of the really innovative environmental people I work with don't want to do regulatory compliance because they think it's not innovative enough. But uh, I've been doing this work for over 20 years now, and like what's happening with regulations right now, for one, that's the only thing companies are investing in is regulatory compliance. But moreover, the regulations themselves are the most exciting and innovative and forward-looking that have ever existed. So don't write off regulatory compliance, lean into it and use it as a lever for innovation. You can't sidestep it, and in fact, like it's far more progressive and aggressive than people think to encourage innovation. Um, yeah.
Thanks a lot, Matt. So it's really valuable to have the point of view of Matt here, because who am I? I'm like an crazy academic saying those things, but he's actually been practicing them, so he knows what he's talking about. So just a couple of points of definition here. We're going to talk about laws. Laws are the outline and general guidelines of the issue. These are typically voted by governments, and this is the sort of overarching intention of where the governments would like to go. So they will pass things like green acts or clean acts or green deal. This is one of the law that the European Union, for instance, placed. But these rarely actually go into the details of how things are going to actually be implemented. This is happening via regulations, which often comes from the administration. So we have some representative here of the Indonesia administration, right? And you guys are the people who are writing these regulations and actually translating the intent of the law into the regulatory framework that is actually implemented by the companies. So it provides the detail of how the law should be obeyed. Just to give you an example of how it happened in the United States, these are the number of laws that have been passed over this period of time from the 1970s all the way to the year 2000 on environmental regulations in general. And you can see that they have really gone up. And one of the turning points, I think, which is really interesting here to see the interplay between regulatory framework and the society, is that there was this book in the United States, you heard about it earlier, called Silent Spring. I'm just showing this because as a person who was born and raised in Europe, I didn't know at all about this book until I came to the US, and I was like, oh, you don't know Silent Spring? And I'm like, no, sorry. So that a lot of this as well is very cultural, right? So I just wanted to point this out for you guys. But some of the things that happen in the US is that this actually spurred a movement that actually translated into politicians paying more attention to these questions. And arguably, you could say that this is the moment when people started to ramp up on the buildup of all of these laws that were turned into regulations and are actually now being implemented to protect the water, to protect the air, to protect, now more recently, regulate the transition to cleaner energy and so on and so forth. So chemical regulations, we can compare the two systems here. So we have in the United States, there's a law that is called the Toxic Substance Control Act, which was passed in 2016. It's called TSCA. This particular regulation is about providing adequate information with respect to the effect of chemical substances and mixtures. And this is a law that was, again, linked to the health and the environment. So you recognize here the sort of green chemistry fingerprints in behind this. And it regulates chemical substances which present an unreasonable risk to of injury to health and the environment. And people are to take action with respect to these chemical substances, which are an imminent hazard. And the authority should be exercised such in a manner as to not impede unduly or create unnecessary economic barriers to technological innovation. So actually written there, they already say that they want to mitigate the risk as well to technical innovation while they are applying these regulations on dangerous chemicals. We want to put that in regards to another regulation, which is called REACH, Registration, Evaluation, Authorization, and Restriction of Chemicals. So this is a completely different law that happened in the European Union a little earlier, actually a decade earlier, 2006. And the approach here is very different. What they wanted to do is they wanted to put really as a premium the protection of human health and the environment. And in order to do that, they said, we need to know what's in the products, right? Because governments realize that this act here that you have is actually impossible to even look into if you don't know what is in the products. Because in the highly tight economy that we live in with very complex supply chains, people realize that they don't even know what are the chemicals that are present in a given equipment. So you take a computer, we'll all have computers or phones. They're composed of thousands of components, all made by hundreds of different companies around the world. And they don't share information with one another about the chemicals that are present in each of these individual components. And the European Union saw this really as a huge barrier to any form of action to implement a greener environment, because you don't even know what the chemicals are. Maybe they're all safe, maybe they're all good, but no one can even make that statement because we don't know what's in there. So what they did is they said, okay, what we should do is, in order to ensure this level of protection that we want to register all the chemicals so that we can provide an evaluation. But you see, the language is very similar too. There's also the protection of the environment, and there's also this question of competitiveness and innovation that people believe is really rooted into doing that kind of stuff. So the differences between REACH and this TESCA law is that REACH requires the manufacturer to take the first step and identify and assess the risk themselves, which again starts by them having to at least provide a list of the chemicals they have in their products. Under TESCA, actually, this is the opposite. It still puts the burden on the administration, here EPA in the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency, to take the first step in actually being the one who proves that a given company is using a chemical that is not correct. So under REACH, every chemical that goes through the registration process goes through a risk evaluation process, whereas under TESCA, the existing low priority chemicals do not go through the risk evaluation. So under both, the risk screening is done without regard to cost, but control measures take cost into action. So here is some of the things that REACH has been leading to. So here are some components of what REACH does and how it impacted the market. So the first thing is that in REACH, if you do not know what's in your product, you cannot sell in the EU. So if you have no data, you cannot have any market. So if you want market, you need data, right? Very simple. Precautionary action are taken based on hazardous properties of chemicals. So if we're not sure, we're just going to ban it and really tell you should swap this chemical because we're not sure. So again, if you have a bad chemical, then it may restrict your access to market. What this led to is that it really created the need for greater sharing of information. So your whole supply chain here, all your products going to one another, now required that you have a dialogue so that every player in this chain is able to have full compliancy, full transparency, and full accountability of what's in their products. So that really spurred a lot of discussions. People realized actually things that they had in their product they didn't know. And it actually spurred dialogues and discussion. And in fact, people argue that this created a lot of room for innovation because people who never spoke to each other about what they have in their composition and their formulation started to do that based on this thing. In which the responsibility is on the company to provide the data. So the company has to do the job uh, and define the safe uses of chemicals and communicate with the supply chain. The company also has the responsibility to ask for the permission and authorization for any new chemical that would not have been approved in the past. So if you say, oh, I invented a new chemical, I think it's better, I think it's going to be greener, the burden's on you actually to make the demonstration that this is true as compared to legacy chemicals that would have been used before. So, but more transformations are needed, right? So these are some of the ways we're doing this, but we want to argue that in fact we need to actually go deeper and continue the work moving forward, improving things on the policy side by continuing to have incentive-based regulatory framework, in science to continue to develop green chemistry. Alternatives assessment is actually something we've not spoken about yet. This is another mechanism of doing an evaluation of chemicals. It's a little bit like an LCA, but it's a much more streamlined and faster LCA. It's kind of a quick LCA kind of idea. And the way you would do alternatives assessment is that you would say, I want to compare the 5 products on the market for a certain thing. So we've run an alternatives assessment in my group for Q dots that are used for making really nice screens. And the way it works is that you will say, I have Q dots based on cadmium. I have Q dots based on indium phosphide. I have Q dots based on perovskites. I have Q dots based on carbon dots. And I'm going to do an alternatives assessment which takes into account the impact on the environment and health, one. The performance, so you have a performance indicator because you don't want to take something only based on green chemistry, but then it doesn't work when you put it in the machine, right? And finally, an economic assessment as well, because you want to take into account the fact that if it's prohibitively expensive, it's also not going to work. So that's an example of how you can do that. And alternatives assessment is really rapidly developing, and a number of my friends are arguing that we green chemists should be using alternatives assessment more because it's a quicker way than LCA to access some data. I think personally, having run some, I think it's a very nice way, and it's really being used a lot in the industry. At the same time, it has a lot of holes in them that you need to know about. So I think that this is still an emerging field that more work needs to be done on. 21st century talks in science. So this is this concept that we should try to incorporate toxicity into the science that we do a lot more. And we've talked a lot about the importance of toxicity so far. So this is really something that we see more and more people doing. And one interest there is the development of AI-enabled tools to do rapid toxicology on compounds that we've not developed yet. On the market side, also trying to work on both the demand and the supply. So trying to work on the demand on one side, demand for cleaner products, and on the supply side on the other side to try to enable the producers of greener chemicals and safer chemicals, right? So the main issue remains the control and inspection. So a place like the EU, for instance, has a very well-developed administrative power in controlling things. So for instance, I come from France originally, where there's a really big bureaucracy around doing checks and verifying that laws are applied, which now living in Canada is a lot looser in Canada. So depending on the jurisdiction, this varies greatly, but this concept that you have these laws, these regulations, of course, goes hand in hand with your capacity to police them down the road. Again, the idea is not to scrutinize people too much and let them, develop things. But if, on the other hand, laws are not enforced, it's even worse, right? Because it creates again some regulatory risks for everybody. Okay, so do you like this one? Where did you find it, Lars? Or is it you found it? So yeah, so what we have to do is we live in this world where we live in, so I think it's just to try to express this concept that we live in this world where we know that where we are right now is not great and we're being cooked up, but there's like, are we gonna step in the next difficult situation or not? Where are we gonna put our foot as we move forward, right? So I think the idea here is that when we are replacing hazardous chemical, we really have to be super careful about avoiding regrettable substitutions. So here are some examples of what we call regrettable substitution. So we used to have these types of cars. This is really US based again, guys. So bear with me. We used to have these kinds of Jeep cars, and now they look like that, right? Are they better? Well, they continue to consume a huge amount of gasoline, right? So, have we made a big step forward? Well, it's not really true, right? Uh, this car is super simple. This car is super complex, but in the end of the day, they accomplish the same mission, right? They are only there to drive you. So all this fancy thing that you have here, the heated seats, the fancy air conditioning, the places to plug your phone, and the sort of screens on the back end for the kids to be entertained while you drive, blah blah blah. Is it really necessary? I mean, think again about the function. So, the regrettable substitution is this concept that you replace a toxic chemical with an alternative that has equal or greater toxicity. So, we saw an example of regrettable substitution yesterday when Lars presented to you people who tried to replace BPA, bisphenol A, this endocrine disruptor plasticizer that we use in our plastics, and then they replaced it with molecules that looked very similar and indeed had the same, if not even greater, toxicity. So this was a regrettable substitution. Historically, this regrettable substitution happened a lot, and it happened because of poorly crafted or poorly enforced regulations. You tell companies, oh, I don't want you to use this because it's toxic, but then you don't tell them what's the framework for the replacement. And here it goes. They say, okay, this one's bad. I'm going to find another one. But then if you don't say, demonstrate if it's better or worse, then of course the companies, they're going to still, they want to sell their products. So they're going to find whatever. So this is why the fact of writing these laws carefully is really important to avoid these types of things. This is why, in fact, REACH has this thing here to say, if you come up with something new, you have the responsibility to demonstrate to me, state, that you're doing a good job. And that's specifically to prevent this problem of regrettable substitution. So examples of regrettable substitutions is when California banned the use of when California banned the use of chlorinated solvents, the manufacturer replaced the chlorinated solvent with hexanes, and an employee observed that they had neurological problems, and hexane was identified as a neurotoxic agent, and the replacement with N-propylbromine that happened after that was yet another problem because it is also a neurotoxic agent. So this is an example of how multiple replacements here did not solve the problem to begin with and continue to put on the market molecules that were really toxic and not appropriate. So here are some examples of other regrettable substitution. I mentioned, so this is the example again that Lars showed yesterday. This is bisphenol A. This is bisphenol S. You see that the structure is very similar. Again, the government said no bisphenol A. People say, sure, bisphenol S is here. And sure enough, it's got similar toxicity. Synthetic cooling agent and other flavoring additives in non-menthol cigarettes marketed in California. They so this is no, 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 no. Yeah, so I'm forgetting about this one example specifically. This is another article again about discussing general aspects about this concept of regrettable substitution, and this idea that you're playing whack-a-mole. Who knows about who knows what whack-a-mole is here? You don't know, right? You want to explain? So whack-a-mole is this game where this is a very popular game in the United States. Yeah, where you have a hammer. Exactly. So you have a table with a bunch of holes, and on any hole a mole is gonna come out. And what you have to do is hit it when it comes out. But of course it's very hard because you have no idea what's gonna come. So you're always constantly. So in the United States, we call this whack-a-mole, and that's has become a way to say this is a problem that is constantly hitting you and you're never prepared, right? So again, this notion that you are in a very a high risk level environment if you don't tell the companies to prove that the next guy is less toxic, because the governments are just waiting here to see where is my next regrettable substitution going to come up, or and then lead to these types of press, and then have some adverse effect. Flame retardants, another example. So chemicals that are there to prevent fire from coming up. They have been very typically based on toxic chemicals, especially brominated species, and then the next ones that are coming are yet again similarly toxic, and this is an example of that. So um, So risk-based chemical by chemical analysis is the way that you can do that. So the way is that you identify a substance. Here, you're going to do some scoping. So here are the molecules that I can use as replacements. I'm going to then enter this thing where I look into the fate and transport. So this is my molecule that I want to evaluate as a replacement. I'm going to see how it interacts with the environment, moves around. I'm going to look into how it affects the environment, and then potentially expose people through the environment to make a risk assessment. I can also run hazard identification, so really like classic toxicity, and weigh whether it is a safe chemical or not a safe chemical, which allows to do this dose response assessment. And finally, combining the environmental route with the more straightforward toxicity, you can have an overall risk assessment, which can lead to decision making. So that's a framework for you to think about this replacement system and evaluating their toxicity. So this is DDT, so an example of a molecule that has problems and would need replacement. I mean, DDT is again, we're going to talk about this a little bit more later. It's a molecule that has huge toxic effects on the environment, especially to bird populations. Unfortunately, it's also really efficient for killing mosquitoes, and for that reason, we are yet to find a good alternative. So there's still everywhere in the world localized places where people have been authorized exceptionally to use DDT because it's the only one that can kill mosquitoes. And in places where malaria have outbreaks, it's actually important to do that for public health. But it is really problematic that it does have an effect on the bird population, and at the same time, because it is non-degradable, it will accumulate in the environment. Another class of molecules is PFAS, and we were having this discussion yesterday about them. We have an expert in someone looking at PFAS in water actually here. So this is something that we continue to talk about. Very complicated to break down. So organohalogen flame retardants is a subclass created on the basis of a combination of structural characteristics, physical properties, and biology. And these types of molecules are really important for us to try to find alternatives. So some of the physical chemical properties are seen here. These are really important factors because they really explain how these particular molecules can interact with the environment. So some of the physical properties that are important are the molecular weight. This gives some ideas about how they can be transported in the environment. They can transport in our bodies. The boiling point will give you an idea of whether they are volatile or not, which plays a role in their fate as well as their impact on the atmosphere. The octanol water partition coefficient is really important because it gives you an idea as to whether this can bioaccumulate in the fat parts of the body. So if something is liking a lot, is partitioning a lot towards octanol, this means it could be bioaccumulative in the bodies of large animals in the environment. Solubility in water, ionization potential. So ionization potential and polarizability are factors that can talk about the toxicity because it talks about their chemical reactivity. So these are some of the things that you can play to actually predict toxicity, because based on that, you can actually. So if you take a new molecule, let's say, that you've never evaluated, based on these types of properties, you can use them as proxies to start to understand how toxic they can be to the environment and human health. And there's been some work that's been done along these lines. So these properties that I'm mentioning, this is the properties in particular of DDT here, they are inherent. So this is the properties of this molecule. They will always have this property, no matter how you formulate that, this DDT will always be this way. And we can control these by fine-tuning it. So if I change this molecule here, I replace the chlorines, I break some bond, I add some substituents, I am going to directly affect them. And this is where we chemists have the power to come in and be creative, is we can change these molecules to make it better. So this is how these physical chemical properties relate directly to hazard. So if you have a novel chemical that you've invented, let's say, based on its oxygen balance and acidity, basicity, you can actually directly look into physical hazard directly. So the oxygen balance, for instance, will be able to tell you about the propensity of this molecule to ignite and to start to form a fire. So you can actually prevent risks based on flammability, for instance. The air-water coefficient that I mentioned earlier, the water solubility, would actually allow you to understand how it will interact with the environment. Go in the water, like drop on the or remain stuck in on the soil, in the sediments. So this will allow us to have an understanding of the global hazard from the perspective of the environment. If it is more or less volatile, it's also likely to go to the atmosphere or remain in the water bodies. Then looking at other kinds of properties, such as lipophilicity, the number of freely radiated bonds, you can have an evaluation of the toxicity, toxicokinetics. And finally, based on that, have an evaluation of the toxicological and ecotoxicological hazard. And this is based again on some of these intrinsic properties, such as the N-octyl water partitioning coefficient, which we discussed earlier, as well as the HOMO-LUMO gap, which is again something you can very easily access by a computer calculation. So all of these points are things that we can now have the ability to predict before we even make the molecule. So all of that we can map out with, we have a reasonable now understanding of a lot of these processes that we can make a reasonable evaluation even before we've made the first molecule of that new compound. So this is to tell you that we're now having our power in our hands, the power to make predictions and avoid these regrettable substitutions. So which door are we going to choose, right? Well, the choice is ours. We need the needs implied by society or its laws are always an opportunity for new solutions. So I think that one way you can look into this is like, oh, we're burdened with this thing that we have to prove the non-toxicity. This is painful. But I would argue that this is an opportunity for you, right? Invent the next great molecule, invent the molecules that are going to have the function we need and at the same time take us out of this ever happening cycle of regrettable substitution. Because business as usual will not save the planet, right? So often we simply need to rephrase the problem statement to find a better solution. So we don't want to do business as usual. No, no, no. We want to invent this new way, and this new way that will allow us to achieve the UN's SDGs, right? So why do we do green chemistry? Whenever we identify a problem, we have all the tools to find a solution and to make the change. So what we want to argue here is that it's really by better defining the problem that we're going to be able to find a solution. So an example of that has been is an example of how we can actually an example of how better defining the problem has led to solution is with the CFCs. So CFCs are molecules that have a lot of carbon halogen bonds. And what these molecules have been used at is they were used as refrigerants in the fridge. So in the up to the 90s, these were really hugely used and they were present in all of the refrigerators in the United States. Initially, they were invented because they were replacing really, really toxic agents that could leak to the environment and cause really toxic effects. When CFCs were invented, people were like, these are amazing molecules because they're really stable, they're non-toxic, this is great, we're going to put them in all the fridges and have this refrigerant liquid being really good. And we will stop having kids going on the landfill and being contaminated by these refrigerants. But the problem is that people had no idea that when these CFCs goes in the atmosphere, they do something really crazy. So in the atmosphere, you have an ozone layer, right? We all know that. And this ozone layer is very critical because it allows to filter the most noxious UV signals, UV radiations that's coming from the sun. But what people didn't know is that the CFCs, they also have the ability to interact with this ozone layer and destroy it. So specifically, CFCs, under the effect of UV light that you can find in this in the high atmosphere, you create radicals of chlorine that are going to interact directly with ozone, and via this mechanism, destroy the ozone and turn it into regular oxygen. None of that is ozone is actually toxic to us when it happens at the at our level of the atmosphere, right? But up there, ozone is good because it does this filtration. So what is happening here is that you gradually reduce the ozone layer, and what is happening is that the ozone layer started to have a big hole that started to happen. So for this reason, people decided, okay, the CFCs, no matter how good they are for us, we need to ban them because if we don't make it stop, the ozone layer is going to be gone. So the Montreal Protocol, so this is a treaty that was signed in 1999 in Montreal, decided to ban these CFCs around the globe. And the worldwide threat of the ozone layer depletion actually was a big driver to doing that. And it worked. It worked. This ozone layer actually was saved. It's really important because I know that in Australia, they still have the highest level of skin cancer today because of the ozone layer depletion that happened at that time. And so the Montreal Protocol regulated all of these chlorinated molecules that you can see here. And by doing so, they really managed, by the beginning of the 90s, to actually curb their production. So this is the Montreal Protocol trajectory. So the molecules were banned, but obviously they are still in the environment. So this is why you sort of see them here. And the effective chlorine concentration is only slowly going down now. If there had been no protocol, we can estimate that there would have been this continued uprise trend that would have really seriously threatened the ozone layer. And now the ozone concentration, you can see here that with the Montreal Protocol in 2021, the ozone layer concentration, which is mostly localized here on the poles, has been restored to really good values in the 500 Dobson unit, as compared to a scenario where the Montreal Protocol would not have happened, in which we would have had almost a complete depletion of the ozone layer in these regions. So this is a little bit of a data about who phased it out and when and how it's unfolded. But essentially, the take-home message here is that it worked. It's regulation that was adopted globally. People agreed that it was a problem. They really saw this coming. They made the decision. Now we have very good replacement for these molecules, and everything is much better. So another example is here the production of microplastics. So we all know that plastics are a huge problem. They are everywhere in our lives. We can see them in everything that we do. We all know that, unfortunately, a fraction of the plastic that we make end up in the ocean and the environment, where they can be turned into microplastics. These plastics debris are going to be sedimented. So there's still a huge amount of unknown, actually. There's a lot of it that a lot of the microplastics we do not account for when you look into the data. It's considered that we probably lose track of 90% of it, that people assume is actually just simply sedimenting. But even if it just sediments, we don't know what's the consequence of that. Where is this plastic going to go, right? The part that remains mobile is eaten by fish and other microorganisms in there. It makes it its way all the way to us via fishing, and we now know that we have plastics in our bodies, microplastics. We can detect them. So the Basel Convention in 1999 was developed on the control of the transboundary movements of hazardous waste and their disposal. So parts of the reason why this is happening is because we use plastics, and especially single-use items, which have a high chance of going into the environment. And it is considered that these single-use plastics are the majority of the global marine plastic pollution. You see here that the level of uncertainty is really high. So when you go in the sea and you collect microplastics, there's a huge dependence on where you look and what you find. So people have looked in certain places and found that the composition of the plastic indicates that it's probably 100% single use. But I know of data where you go in the east coast of Canada and you collect plastics, and the majority is coming from fishing gears. So fishing nets, broken buoys, broken parts from boats, and so on. So it's really very dependent on where you are. So this is like estimate 60 to 95%. It's not very accurate, but it's because research is still, we're still trying to figure it out about all of these things. Going back to this notion that when we have single-use plastic, we take a lot of time to make stuff and then we use them in really limited amount of time. It's estimated that a single-use plastic will be used an average of 12 minutes. So this is, I think, a call for us to change our ways of living. So when you look at this problem, this is a global problem, right? We all use plastics all around the world. We do that in the United States. We do that in Canada. We do that in Europe. We do that here in Indonesia. We do that everywhere. Yet, when we look at the data, we find that most of the plastics going to the ocean is actually coming from a small number of rivers, all of which are located in Asia and Africa. Why is that so? That the production is global, the consumption is global, yet pollution comes mostly from these countries. And that's because for many years, there's been a trading of this waste. So, um, what you find is that, there's been exchanges of plastics from different countries around the globe, with the majority of the plastics actually ended up in poorer countries in Africa and in China and Southeast Asia. So actually, I don't know about the specific case of Indonesia, but I know that there was a lot of plastics that has been shipped to Indonesia, to the Philippines, and there's been a lot of bans that have happened over the years to now restrict and prevent the importing of these types of plastics, which is actually helping, although there are some illegal trades that still happen. But China, for instance, completely banned this around 2020, 2021, I believe. Indonesia and Philippines, I think, followed suit very rapidly, but it's still happening, right? So there's still some issues around that. But this notion of regulating exchanges of waste goods is really important, and it started in this Basel Convention some 30 years ago plus. Another example of a regulation that has been successful is the use of mercury. So what is mercury? Mercury is this really interesting metal that it's the only metal that we have that is liquid at room temperature and normal pressure. It is actually getting into the environment through a number of ways. So in fact, mercury is present in the environment, and when you create a new dam anywhere in the world, you will flood massive amounts of water, and there's often mercury enough in a soil that when you do that, it will displace mercury, and just the fact of creating a dam will cause mercury pollution in those places. So this is kind of a anthropogenic yet naturally occurring mercury that you have to deal with. Another way that this can happen is through coal power plants. So coal power plants, because coal contains small quantities of mercuries, as you burn lots and lots of coal, you will inject significant amounts of mercury into the environment unless you have something that will filter it out. But a lot of the mercury that is ending up in the environment is coming from that source. There's a small scale gold mining practices, because when you collect gold, you can use mercury to actually trap the gold from the rest of the dirt that you're collecting. So it's used a lot, especially by gold miners, like individual gold miners who want to try to make a little bit of money by chasing gold. But you also have mercuries in a bunch of other things, from batteries to dental filling, to blood pressure measuring devices, to light bulbs, to cosmetics that can contain it, and to mercury thermometer as well. The problem with this is that this has a health impact. So we know that we could get some mercury contamination through eating fish and shellfish. There's a lot of debates about that. I was reading actually a New York Times articles maybe 2 weeks ago, where they're still trying to debate how much tuna you could eat in your life, in your day, will not affect you, and still saying that it's not maybe the greatest idea to eat tuna when you're pregnant, because it could contain enough mercury to be toxic. Mercury is toxic to the kidneys. This is the major point of interest, and it's also toxic to the brain. So people who are handling mercury for small-scale mining, for instance, are really at high risk. And the mercury fumes, in particular from broken thermometers and blood pressure devices, are also things to be attentive to. So the story of how mercury really came out to the public knowledge is through the Minamata Bay disaster in Japan. So in the 50s, they started to plant there, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And they started to notice that people had really adverse effects in the neighboring region of Minamata Bay, especially two sisters. You can see one of them here. Age 2 and 5 were diagnosed in Minamata Bay with crippling and untreatable stigmatizing effects of mercury poisoning. And in the decades that followed, tens of thousands of adults, children, and unborn infants and even animals suffered from what is known as the Minamata disease. And this is just severe mercury intoxication. So what happened in Minamata is that they created a plant. So a coal-fired plant could emit mercury. But in this is a different process. It's a process for the production of vinyl chloride and acetaldehyde, which was using stoichiometric amounts of mercury and releasing in the environment a really toxic form of mercury, which is called methyl mercury, dimethyl mercury. This is a form of mercury that is the most toxic that you can think of. It's really potent. It can go in your body and really have crippling effects right away. This methyl mercury went into the fish, which then went into the people, and this is how the poor Minamata Bay people were affected. So these two charts are actually really good visuals to showcase how mercury is mobile in the environment and can populate the environment. This is telling you how, in particular, mercury, which is mercury zero, is actually not that toxic, but it's through oxidation in the environment and methylation that you have the most toxic form, which is methyl mercury here. And this is how it gets into the tuna that people can eventually eat. Of course, in the case of Minamata Bay, the effects were really more tragic because they directly injected methyl mercury. It had really high levels. There were really high levels of that in the fish, and it really created these really acute toxicity effects that you could see just a slide before. But the good news again is that there was action that was taken. The Minamata Convention was signed to actually try to handle mercury better. So of course the Chiso catastrophe was handled by changing the process in this plant and preventing the release of methyl mercury altogether. But it remains a big problem, especially in the context of gold mining that I mentioned. So lots of countries in South America, in Africa, and in Asia as well and Indonesia is certainly a part of that, are crippled with that problem where people will go out there, try to find gold, and try to use these kinds of DIY method using mercury to collect the gold. And there's been lots of actions to do that. So the Minamata Convention in particular struck national action plans around these countries to try to regulate and help artisanal and small gold mining sector with transitioning out of mercury. And this is what this looks like. So gold-rich nuggets can be isolated by density, and the separation and isolation of these gold nuggets with mercury is just a very easy and convenient way to run it. But at the same time, of course, it exposes people with this liquid state mercury, which, as we mentioned, is very toxic. So through action, people have been. So this is the way it looks for small scale artisanal gold mining, and you can see the gold nuggets here being released. And through the Minamata Bay action, people are being educated and taught on how to separate the gold in a way that is safe without the use of mercury. And finally, we'll talk a bit about DDT. So we mentioned earlier DDT as being a really toxic molecule for the environment. So what it does is that it goes in the environment and the birds are not able to grow as thick a shell. You can see here these are eggs that cannot even resist their own weight because the DDT meant that the bird was not able to grow a regular thickness for the shell here. So this meant that this meant that the DDT is something that has been also transmitted from generations to generations. So this is also something that remains in the environment, and at the same time, because it is non-degradable, once it's out there, it also stays there. So from the 40s onwards, DDT was used in really large scale, industrial scale, to protect crops from insects and then also to protect human beings from malaria bearing mosquitoes. And at the time, so in the 40s and the 50s, you can check out with a Google search, you can find lots and lots of ads out there to say that DDT is really good, it's really safe. So at the time, they were selling these wallpaper that were infused with DDT, and you had the kid next to it uh, saying, this is safe for your kid, and it's going to be good because your kid is not going to be uh, uh, beaten by a mosquito that has malaria. So do that for your kids. They were selling sprays. They were selling all sorts of things containing DDT. And of course, this is problematic because, again, it will be transmitted through generations from generations. So here's a little history of how DDT was invented from this Austrian student all the way to now. So again, a big moment is when DDT has started to be introduced in the United States and was really thanked for saving millions by killing vectors of malaria, typhus, and other types of diseases in the US in particular. There were even Nobel Prizes that were delivered for this molecule, but at the same time in the 60s, so some 60 years later, it was first massively introduced, we see declines in birds' population. And people relate this to insecticides, and eventually it led to the ban of the use of DDT, except for really essential public health uses. And we are still living under that law, I guess, in the United States right now. You could see Silent Spring again, the book that I mentioned earlier, coming up at that time. So one of the other effects of DDT, as I was mentioning, is that it's a persistent chemical. So what is problematic is that even if you decide that you're going to ban it today, we still live with a DDT that has been emitted for generations, right? So what this means is that the DDT is going to go in the environment. If it is, it will actually be. It has a low enough vapor pressure that it can go into the atmosphere and be redeposited, so it can actually move in this entire ecosystem. It can be eaten by animals and be biomagnified, so meaning go up the food chain. At the same time, another really interesting thing that happens is that these types of bad molecules, they often end up in the poles. And the reason for that, it's a phenomenon called the grasshopper effect, by which a molecule that is bad and volatile, like DDT, is going to go in the atmosphere. And of course, the hotter the country, the hotter the environment, this partition will favor the atmosphere more here. So you have more of the DDT that goes to the atmosphere here than here than here. Gradually, the DDT will move with winds and so on. And then here it has a slightly higher chance for coming down because, again, of this the different temperature. And what happens is that through these multiple evaporation redeposition, we find higher quantities of DDT in the poles than we do, for instance, here. And we know that we can detect DDT in the breast milk of women in north of Canada. And we know that there's huge amounts of problems of contamination of people there that are far greater than for people here or for people in the temperate regions of the world. So this is really something to take into account as well, is that pollution is a moving target. Things are not only staying where they've been created. We have lots of mechanisms by which things get spread and eventually accumulate in places where these people never spread DDT. They don't even know what a mosquito is, and yet they have DDTs in their bodies. So that's the other mechanisms that I mentioned earlier, which is that when it gets in the environment, it will be absorbed by typically phytoplanktons and zooplankton or phytoplankton here. So phytoplanktons are eaten by zooplankton, which are then eaten by small fish, and then those small fish get eaten by the rest of the of the population of sea mammals and fish, bigger fish. What ends up happening is that these sea mammals and fish, they have high proportion of fat in their bodies. So some of these, and also they live a long time. So what will happen is that you have an effect that is called biomagnification. So this is the effect by which even small quantities of pollutants here get accumulated inside these big fish and mammals because they eat more and more of it, and it will start to accumulate in their bodies. If the molecule has more affinity for lipids than for water, it will go inside the fat of these animals, and the longer they live, the more it accumulates. So we have the effect of accumulation across the chain, but also in the lifetime of the animal as well, an increased accumulation. So the youngsters in these populations don't have a lot high contamination, but the old people have. Old members of the population have a high exposure over time. So so DDT does that, but another example is the biochlorinated biphenyls. This is again a polychlorinated molecule that you can see here. This is used, for instance, as a flame retardant, and it has similar kinds of properties, and it will also have this faculty of doing bioaccumulation. So there's a convention called the Stockholm Convention that is regulating these types of molecules that we also called POPs. So we had lots of discussions about POPs, persistent organic pollutants, today in the last few days. So this is again an example of where we are on that front. So the Stockholm Convention, which was signed in 2001, is regulating the synthesis and use of these persistent organic pollutants. It's but even though we have that, the convention still allows some exceptional use. For instance, the use of DDT here, especially in areas where we have potentially mosquitoes that carry malaria. And you can see here some of the countries in use in which the DDT is still considered useful. So here are some examples of the POPs. So just a few chemicals. Maybe we can go through them really quickly. You will recognize the DDT here. You recognize here some dioxins. This is so some really molecules that are used as insecticides or as additives. Here we have other insecticides, fungicides as well over there. So yeah. So what's really interesting is that POPs are often based on molecules containing fluorine molecules, chlorine atoms, or bromine atoms. You can see again some other examples here illustrating this. This is some of the well-known PFASs. So we mentioned that PFAS are these molecules that contain high level of fluorine atoms. So these CF bonds here are the reason that explain that these parts of the molecule will not stick to anything, whether this is lipophilic or hydrophilic, really creating this interesting property molecules, but at the same time acting as a really potent pollutant and also toxic chemical. So they're used as flame retardants, they're used as repellents, they're used again in firefighting, but they are also molecules that come from the breakdown of these longer PFASs that we use, for instance, like Teflon, to coat our pans. Other examples here of chlorinated species like this plasticizer here, paraffin, or this UV328, which is also used as a plasticizer. Some other examples here, solvents. We don't have it here, but perchloro and trichloroethylene are really big pollutants as well. I was discussing it earlier with the colleague here, used as solvents for the dry cleaning industries in particular. Still used around the globe, and a persistent pollutant. So I just want to close the discussion today by transitioning to the future. So we've seen here some examples of how past regulations have had some effect. We saw the ozone layer being saved by some regulation that was adopted. We saw the reduction of POPs production thanks to the Stockholm Convention, the Minamata Convention regulating mercury uses. Of course, we've discussed that some worked and some are not perfect, but have done some improvement. In the future, we should watch out for new regulations, and I wanted to highlight what's happening in the European Union in particular. The European Union are really developing some pretty extensive and I think really sweeping changes in this landscape, and I think it's a jurisdiction to really watch out for the future. So the EU passed what's called a Green Deal, which contains different kinds of plans, especially a circular economy plan, a sustainable products initiative, and also something around eco design and energy labeling that is really looking into trying to tap onto some of the problems that we've been talking about in the last little while. Some of the focus here is on reducing waste. So, for instance, the new circular economy plan is really trying to tackle this question of recycling of plastics and making it a lot more effective, both by working on the plastic itself, but also on the recycling part, on the consumer point as well, which is super important in this field. Also implementing laws such as the right to repair. So this is saying that if you buy any product and you want to repair it, the company has the obligation to do it. And we now know that with modern manufacturing, a number of things cannot be repaired, like by default. The spare parts don't exist, the machine has been sealed in a way that you cannot open it, etc., etc. So now the European Union is going after that face on and will make it impossible to sell a product in the European Union that cannot be repaired. And this is quite a sweeping change because it's going to really force companies to make a change, and it probably will have global implication because, again, a company that's global cannot afford to not sell in the EU. So these are some of the policies that are being put up. And one of the ones that is coming up in particular is the CSRD, which is this obligation for companies to disclose their sustainability plans, essentially. So now each company will have to have a plan on to how they're going to transition to a more sustainable practice on a number of different points. So this is some of the things that Matt has shared with me. Maybe you want to talk about it a bit more eloquently than I can do. But the idea here is that this is the kind of plans that companies will have to come up with to showcase that they're really implementing different levels of strategies, from the vision to the actual action and the accountability and governance that they will put in place to ensure that they do what they claim they will. And here you see the shift, which is really important, and it starts from reach. The European Union has really understood that a way to move forward is to make it the responsibility of the companies. It's no longer the state that has to go after them and go inside the plant and check the stuff. The company has to come up with the plan. The company has to come up with the evidence that they did the right job. And I think that's really something that we see is having a large impact on the implementation of these regulations. So I'm leaving you with that. You can do more searches from this. This is really upcoming. You see, this is 2024. So this is really something that is happening right now and can really serve as an inspiration. So what have we seen so far? Chemical regulations, REACH and TASCA was this where we started to talk about regulations that are implemented right now. We went back in time a little bit to talk about regrettable substitution, how regulations can happen, focusing specifically on properties. We've been talking about the Montreal Protocol, the Basel Convention, Minamata, Stockholm Conventions, and their impact on regulations around CFCs, mercury, POPs, and so forth. We spoke a little bit about POPs and upcoming EU regulations. So I want to leave some time for discussions, obviously. I hope that I could give you some ideas about how regulations can be positive and also of their limitations, because nothing's perfect, but hopefully giving you some tips, and especially to the governments or government related people in the audience, give you some ideas about how you can take inspirations from these things. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Prof. Audrey. Okay, so again, discussion time. So any questions first here in the room? Yes, we have several. We have two raised hands.
Good morning, Prof. Audrey. I'm Daisy. I'm from ITERA. I want to some question for you.
Sure.
First, could you tell us about toxicokinetics? And then, what is the material can be replaced by using CFC and DDT?
Yes. Okay,
Yeah.
got you. So you want to replace DDT and you want to know about toxicokinetics.
Yes.
Yeah. So, okay. So I think toxicokinetics is measuring the toxicity of, so it's measuring the effect over time of a bioactive molecule. So you will measure the effect of the thing over a certain period of time. And this is why it's called toxicokinetics. Am I right here, Lars? I think so, yeah. I think it's something along these lines. So you have different levels of toxicity. You have typically something that's used is called LD50 or LC50. So this is you take a population, you will feed them with the drug or the toxin or whatever, and then you measure what is the dose at which 50% of the population dies, or 50% of the population develops an adverse effect. And that is called the LC50 or LD50. So that's more an absolute value. But then you could do what's called toxicokinetics, which is measuring effects over time for the metabolism. So where does it go and how it's. Bear in mind, I'm not a toxicologist, but that's.
For example, yesterday we saw this graphic from the phthalates in what they break down into. So that's an interesting study because the phthalates will not persist as the exact phthalate molecule in your body, but they will break down to metabolites. And those breakdown steps will occur in different rates, different kinetics. So it's always important to see what are the metabolites over time that a specific structure breaks down into. And maybe a metabolite might even have a bigger toxic effect. For DDT, for example, the main toxic effect is not DDT itself, it's its first metabolite, where one of the chlorine atoms actually in the middle gets abstracted. And that compound is even more toxic than DDT and has a bigger effect. So the degradation of it will lead to subproducts, other metabolites, and some of them might be more problematic, actually. So it's really important to look at that.
Carbon tetrachloride. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of examples like this in regulations. So one very common solvent, or used to be, was carbon tetrachloride, and it was used in very large volumes. It's likely probably still used in Indonesia for certain applications like brake cleaning or machine cleaning. As it breaks down in soil, it turns to trichloro, uh, uh, what is TCM, trichloromethane, and then it breaks down into vinyl chloride. And each of these subsequent breakdown products are actually more and more toxic. So these toxokinetics are very important things for these regulations to understand not just the immediate impacts, but the impacts of the breakdown products. Although it's very expensive generally to do a full panel of assessments for assessing like LD50, especially because there's different things for different organs and all sorts of stuff. But now they have these big robots. So they used to test it on animals, and still do. But now they have these robots that they basically have all these cells, like different cell lines from the human body, and they test different concentrations on these cells with these robotic arms. It's called Tox 21. So if you're interested in this type of toxokinetics, you can look at the Tox 21 Research Consortium. Probably, I think, leading a lot of this really innovative effort to try to understand these problems.
Yeah, and you mentioned DDT as a replacement. So my understanding is that there's no molecule that can match DDT. And this is why it's still used. Yeah.
That's why the Stockholm Convention doesn't forbid it for the use for mosquito control in certain countries. So, especially in Central Africa and India, mosquitoes are still a huge problem. And for humanitarian reasons, DDT is not forbidden in the Stockholm Convention. But for widespread use for pest control, yes, because there are alternatives for that.
So guys, if you want to work on inventing the replacement for DDT, this is a great research project. You know.
The last question:
Sure.
is there oxidation number can influence about the toxicity?
Yeah. So it's difficult to make a sweeping statement about that because each molecule is a bit different in the way the toxicity is developed. The but the oxygen level is important to account for the flammability and the explosivity. So this is really an important factor. So when we saw the physical chemical parameters that will trigger hazard, the oxygen content is really linked to the physical hazard, so the risks for flammability and explosivity. The presence of oxygen then can also play on the toxicity. Sometimes more hydroxy group will mean less toxic in general. But yeah, I think it's really used mostly for the physical risks, not the toxicological risks.
Okay, because I look from your mercury slide. There is a zero oxidation number for mercury and become the third oxidation number.
Oh, you
And
mean the
then,
redox state
yeah.
of mercury? Absolutely. So that's very true. So mercury 2 is much more toxic than mercury 1. Thank you so much. Mercury 2 is much more toxic than mercury 1. And that's because I think it's the mechanism I think is via DNA methylation, right? So this guy is really bad because it methylates DNA and it damages DNA. That's the mechanism of toxicity. And mercury 2 can be methylated easily, right? So you can have this happen more easily. Mercury 0 is less toxic. But what you can happen is that if you, for instance, breathe fumes of mercury 0, because mercury 0 is vapor pressure, room temperature, so you can breathe fumes of mercury 0, then inside your body this reaction can happen. But this is the bad guy. This is the one that will methylate your DNA. Yeah, cadmium is the same idea. Cadmium 2. So cadmium 2 is present in particular in rice because again these are metals that were naturally occurring but have been mobilized by human activity. So riziculture has been moving around cadmium and artificially concentrated cadmium in the place where rice is grown. And cadmium, the highest risk of cadmium poisoning is actually coming from huge consumption of rice. So it's known that it can do that. And cadmium has the same effect of methylating DNA via its redox 2 state. So yeah, so redox state of metals. So to rephrase your question, the redox state of metal is a huge factor in that toxicity. Because I think it's when cadmium is oxidized, it's very oxidized, like it's non-toxic. It's really cadmium 2, I think, that is toxic.
Yeah, it's also methyl cadmium.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you're interested, there's actually a very tragic story about methyl mercury poisoning from a chemist. She was a chemist in the US or Canada, and she had to work with methyl mercury, and she accidentally dropped some of the methyl mercury on her glove, and it goes through gloves in 1 or 2 seconds and touches your skin. And once it touches your skin, it goes into your body very quickly. So she know that she fatally intoxicated herself and could observe what happened to her, because mercury poisoning is a neurological poisoning. So she actually wrote a diary about her own
Death.
Death.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I can find the name for you. It's not very nice to read, but
Yeah. Did we answer your questions? Thank you so much. And guys, I really love the depth of the questions here. This is really really impressive. Yeah. Yeah, I was expecting a question from you, my friend. I've like all those slides were for you, right?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Audrey. Not in
Yeah.
French.
Yeah, we could do it in French if you want, but after.
Okay, thank you. My name is Muhammad Yudhistira Aziz, or call Mr. Aziz, from chemistry department of ITB. Especially, I work in pollutant, organic pollutant. And it's nice, interesting about the regulation that you presented. Uh, you know that the many pollutant in river or ocean, we call they are transformed to another compounds.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
we say that xenobiotic compounds like that. So this regulation consider like transformation of chemicals or chemical waste, not only how to use or assessment toxicity in the environment. I just want to know, like, do the
Yeah.
all regulation consider that? And the second one, what the upcoming regulation next the point of view after Stockholm Convention? Because the Stockholm Convention may be uh, concern just about the pops there. They are emerging pollutants. They are pharmaceutical next or microplastic. Uh, uh, it's all cover that's pollutants, recent pollutants in global uh, issue like that. Consider in regulation, upcoming regulation next in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you so much. These are absolutely great questions. Thanks a lot for asking. So, I just wanted to yes to start with the slide here where you see that a very important part of understanding toxicity is understanding fate. You have fate in the environment that you can see here, which is really important. This is a huge area of research. You have you have thousands of researchers around the globe just looking at that type of stuff, and you have the fate inside the body. We discussed the pharmacokinetics as well. So both these actually look at exactly what you're saying, that molecules will react, break down, start to make other metabolites or other compounds that can have more or less more or less toxicity as compared to the thing that they started from. And we've discussed all of these. So I think that one way to view this is that we know of the fate of some of these chemicals, like DDT. We discussed it. In fact, DDT itself is not the toxic part; it's the thing, it's the molecules in which it transforms that are the true toxins. So I would say some of these conventions have taken this into account just by virtue of looking at what's out there. So DDT is an example of that. I would say that in the future, with the new regulations such as the one you have in the EU, which is trying to really force people to do upfront toxicity tests, and eventually as well all of these models that we're talking about for accelerating toxicology development and toxicology discoveries, we're going to make more and more decision based on these effects, on these degradation pathways, and so on and so forth. So I think the EU is showing the way that they're no longer trying to address the problem of one specific class of compound, but really trying to address it across the entire chemical industry in a way that will take into account all of the effects that you mentioned. You're correct that the Stockholm Convention as a short list of molecules that we saw here, and for sure this calls for a renewal of that convention. I am not familiar with any of the specifics of that. Maybe you are. So I will leave Lars the answer to that question.
yes. So the Stockholm Convention is actually not a finite list; it's a growing list of compounds. The compounds we saw in the slides here, that's the dirty dozen. That's the first 12 compounds that the Stockholm Convention was sort of based on in 2001. But in this year, actually, we already have 29 compounds in there. So it's not a finite list, it's a growing list of compounds, and more compounds will be added to the Stockholm Convention. So it's always important to look on the website or in the information of the Stockholm Convention what kind of compounds are being entered in the convention. The Minamata Convention, for example, is of course finite because it's only on mercury, but Stockholm is really a growing list, and countries can do recommendations on what kind of compounds or chemicals to include in the future. But yeah, I would recommend to always be looking out for the
Yeah.
kind of compounds that are going
Maybe
to
this
be
is
added.
something that we should do, that before we share the slides with you, we add a slide on the current list of the.
So actually, and there was if you go to the Stockholm Convention part,
Yeah.
there are a few compounds that were the most recent additions to it. One is actually chlorpyrifos, which is a pesticide.
Okay.
And then another one are the short chain chlorinated paraffins, which are often used in the plastics industry as a solvent. And another one
These
are
ones. Right?
It's organophosphor.
which one? Oh yeah, yeah. So actually, it's also on the next slide. No, on the there was one where you had the long and short chain paraffin. So that's chlorpyrifos. That's the pesticide that was added last year, if I'm not mistaken. And there you have the chlorinated paraffins, which sometimes are used as plasticizers. Next one, yeah, there, bottom left, and UV328 is actually an interesting compound that was added, I think 2020 or something like that. It's a plasticizer, and well, a lot of other perfluorinated compounds are going to be added and are already on the candidate list. So there's many.
Yeah. And so we'll get into this tomorrow in how we interpret science and regulations into business. But for folks who are interested in picking research topics, master's topics, PhD topics, or starting businesses, all of these chemicals that are in the process of being banned are an excellent source to start a business for, because you have a few years before companies have to switch, you have some time to scale it up, and there will be a lot of market demand driven by the regulatory shifts. And this is true for not just the Stockholm Convention, but for many other of these global regulatory treaties and conventions. There's always the things that are under discussion. And so if you take a look in what people are discussing, then that's a very good source to direct research and entrepreneurship.
Okay.
Any?
I
We're
think
closing?
yes, because of the time.
Yes.
I'm so sorry, everyone, because of
Not
the
at all.
limited time. Because as scheduled, it's supposed to be at 10:30, and now it's already 10:40. So we're going to head into break time.